One of the hot-button issues confronting evangelical Christians today centers on the topic of evolution. Is it possible for God to use evolution as the means to bring about His creative acts? I'm joined today by Christian scholar Dr. Travis Campbell, who will help us unpack this very complex question. Travis, what would you say to somebody if they ask you this question? Is it possible to reconcile the theory of biological evolution with Christian theology?
I would make the distinction, as I've made before, between what Lewis called mere Christianity, which just is those basic truths you have to believe in order to be a Christian or experience what the Bible calls salvation, and what we might call conservative evangelical theology, which embraces not just mere Christianity, but the creeds of the church, as well as the full inerrancy of the Bible. And so regarding the former question, I just can't see a logical argument from evolution is true to therefore God does not exist, or therefore Jesus did not come to this earth as the incarnate God and die for my sins and so forth. I do, however, see a case to be made from the proposition evolution is true to therefore there was no Adam and Eve as our original pair, which to me would call into question the historical validity of the first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis, which to me undermines also Paul's theology that he lays out in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. And therefore, I think you would have to question the inerrancy of Scripture if evolution is true.
So it would essentially be difficult to reconcile the theory of biological evolution with certain prominent expressions of Christianity, namely evangelicalism.
Yes. And I say that with the full knowledge that Benjamin Warfield, the greatest defender of inerrancy, was a theistic evolutionist of sorts. This would just be one of those areas where I'm not really sure if Warfield got it right.
Now, one of the things that I find problematic from the standpoint of being a biochemist working in the life sciences is that there are, to me, metaphysical implications of evolution that I wonder if even renders evolution incompatible with mere Christianity. And let me explain, and I'd be really interested in your honest reaction to my statements. But when you look at the nature of the evolutionary process, it is an unguided, historically contingent process where the endpoint at the start of the process cannot be specified.
Mm-hmm.
As Stephen Jay Gould said, if you rewound the tape of life and replayed it, the outcome would be very different every time. You have people like Jerry Coyne, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago, or people like P.Z. Myers, who's at the University of Minnesota Morris, or Richard Dawkins, prominent evolutionary biologists who are also outspoken atheists as well, who would argue that there really is no purpose that undermines or undergirds the evolutionary process. So if you're saying humanity came about through the means of evolution, are you in effect are saying there is no inherent value or worth to human beings? Human beings have no special place in the creation. There's no ultimate meaning or purpose to human life. And I find those metaphysical implications of the nature of the evolutionary mechanism very difficult to square with not only evangelicalism or a conservative expression of Christianity, but also with mere Christianity.
Well, I'm thinking as you're saying all of this of the very end of the origin of the species. And Darwin says at the very end, he suggests that a creator breathed life into the first life forms, and from there they evolved. So as far as Darwin was concerned, at least when he wrote The Origin of Species, we could say he was playing to his audience, or right. Maybe he was truly an agnostic or an atheist by that point, but he was just playing to his audience. But it's in the text whether his intention was to placate an audience that was largely theistic or not. And therefore, as the original theory came out, there was no metaphysic standing behind evolution as such, demanding that the process be random. I think that instead of an implication to evolution, I think that this is a metaphysical presupposition that the proponents of evolution that you've just mentioned are wedding to the theory. And if you say that, well, then yeah, it is contrary to mere Christianity. But I don't think that there's anything about evolution per se, the doctrine of common descent, the idea that we all share the same common ancestor, and the idea that certain naturalistic mechanisms are responsible for the evolution of the species. I don't think that those statements in and of themselves imply that they didn't have someone guiding them.
You know, it's interesting because bringing up Darwin, one of the very first adopters of the theory of biological evolution in the United States was Asa Gray, who
Yes.
is a professor at Harvard University. I think he was a botanist by training. And he was also a Presbyterian.
Yes.
And very much committed to his faith as a Christian. And he got into a correspondence with Darwin and Joseph Hooker, who was a good friend of Darwin. And Asa Gray posed the question to Darwin, is it possible that God could have used evolution to create? And Darwin wrote these famous words when he replied, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, horrible, blundering designs that we see in biology, where he saw nature red in tooth and claw.
Mm-hmm.
And from that standpoint, he couldn't conceive how the God of Christianity could be compatible with, again, the nature of the evolutionary mechanism. So that letter suggests that maybe he was really playing to his audience when he made those statements, because, again, these were private correspondences that he was engaged in. Plus, time had transpired since the original publication. So, I mean, it seems to me like you also have another theological issue relating to the idea that death is the engine of creation when you embrace evolution. So it's not just a unguided, purposeless process, but death is also the engine of creation, which is very troubling and disconcerting.
Yeah. And the issues you're raising are philosophical in nature.
Right.
It's not like you're appealing to a scientific fact and saying, okay, this undermines Christianity. You're raising philosophical issues, which I guess evolutionary creationists or theistic evolutionists who do embrace evolution and embrace at least mere Christianity would have to field.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting because as I engage evolutionary creationists who I think are, to a T, sincere, deeply committed Christians, many of them are evangelicals, and they're deeply committed to their faith. And we would have more in common than we have in terms of points of disagreement. So I feel very comfortable extending the right hand of fellowship to these individuals. And they will point out, I think a point that you're making is that these are all philosophical objections, and that people that make these philosophical objections are overstepping the boundaries of science. That evolution just tells us when and how, but it doesn't tell us why. And so to ascribe a lack of purpose to the process is to get into the realm of philosophy and theology and to leave the realm of science. But my response to your point that these are philosophical objections is that it seems like those philosophical objections flow out of the very nature of the evolutionary mechanism. You see what I'm saying? That they seem to be logical entailments. That, in other words, it would be very similar to me saying the scientists have discovered that the universe has a beginning, and that insight actually fuels a philosophical argument for God's existence, the Kalam cosmological argument. Yes. Right? And so if I'm allowed to make that metaphysical conclusion or draw that metaphysical conclusion from science, should we not also draw similar metaphysical conclusions from the science of biological origins? Because a skeptic could say, hey, you're going outside the bounds of science. Science just tells us the universe has a beginning and we're going to stop there. To draw those conclusions is to enter in the realm of philosophy. So I've said a lot.
No, that's fine. But I guess when Darwin looks at some creature feeding on another creature and is horrified by it and says, gosh, I don't understand how God could be using this. I don't find that totally disanalogous to a parent, say, looking at their child suffering from leukemia and saying, I don't see how God could be involved in this. I think that the two are analogous. In fact, a lot of people believe that Darwin's main reason for denying God was the loss of his own daughter.
Right.
He had such a hard time with that terrible pain that he eventually and methodically and progressively went from Christianity to a kind of deism, then to eventually an atheism. And so I think that what those philosophers are raising, those philosophers of science who buy into the evolutionary paradigm and are drawing this implication out of it, what they're really raising is just another version of the problem of evil. And I don't have any doubt that it's very hard to console parents that are suffering as they watch their child suffer from leukemia. That's a very difficult issue to address. I think it's difficult to address the issue of, boy, why is it that God is using this mechanism of death to bring about the evolutionary process? But I think it's easier to deal with because I do think also at the same time we often anthropomorphize death in the animal realm. We think it's just as bad as death in the human realm. And that may not be the case. There are some philosophers of science that I've been reading that have been arguing that animals are not even fully conscious of the fact that they themselves are suffering. It may be that full consciousness is the one factor that you have to be conscious of the fact that you yourself are the one undergoing the suffering that's happening right now. I'm not 100% sure if that's the correct answer,
right.
But at the same time, that's certainly an avenue you can explore. And if that is the case, then the evolutionary creationists may have a philosophical response to this otherwise tricky objection.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this is a very complex issue that involves science and philosophy and theology, and we really only scratched the surface, but hopefully we've at least raised some questions and some points that will prompt our viewers to think more deeply about this issue, and in doing so, I think be better prepared to engage people in our culture with the truth claims ultimately of the Christian faith. So thank you, Travis.
Thank you.